Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. My guest today, Michael Scott Moore, spent 977 days as a hostage of Somali pirates. He's a journalist, and in 2012 he set out for the Somali coast on a reporting trip when he was kidnapped. What followed was a 2.5-year ordeal that he masterfully recounts in his new book, The Desert and the Sea. This book is beautifully written. It's a page-turner, and he really puts you in his shoes during this ordeal. I'll post a link to it on the website. In our conversation, we discuss his capture and time in captivity, as well as broader issues surrounding piracy off the coast of Somalia, including how it began, why it flourished, and why now it's become less of an issue. One thing that does come through from our conversation is that the gang that kidnapped Michael was most certainly part of an organized criminal network whose business was kidnapping hostages for ransom, and they were not necessarily what you would think of typically as pirates. And we do discuss how some of the mechanisms of organized crime helped piracy flourish off the coast of Somalia for so long, and also some of the policy responses that governments around the world can enact to reduce the threat from piracy. This conversation kind of weaves between the personal and the wonky. I think you'll really enjoy it, and I do highly recommend his book, The Desert and the Sea. So here is my conversation with journalist and author Michael Scott Moore.
Well, I went there to write a very different book about Somali pirates, and I went to a part of central Somalia that was not unknown to journalists. So I went with a fixer from Berlin, a Somali elder, who had taken another German journalist there before. And I went with another documentary maker named Ashwin Rahman, who worked for German television, Indian-born, but a very good German videographer. And we were working on separate projects in Somalia, but decided to travel together. And we spent about 10 days getting pretty good material, actually, in the region called Galmudug, which is there in central Somalia. And it encompasses Galkayo, which is the town where I was captured eventually, as well as Hobyo, which is a pirate town most people may have heard of.
And you were there to report on Somali pirates, but it was based on this trial, right? That was ongoing in Berlin that you had followed?
That's right. I was going to work on a broader book about piracy, but I was going to focus on the story of this trial, which was actually taking place in Hamburg. And I had followed it for almost a year. It was this sort of endless trial of 10 Somali pirates who had tried to capture a German cargo ship in about 2010. And they got rounded up by the Dutch Navy and hauled before court. And it was the first pirate trial on German soil in about 4 centuries.
What drew you to like the idea of writing about pirates? Like what made that interesting to you?
Well, that sort of indicates it. The fact that piracy had revived again on Earth was interesting. The last very serious period of piracy was probably the Barbary era, which ended in the early 19th century. So we had gone through at least 200 years of relative peace on the world's oceans. And the fact that there was a region where it was actively dangerous to sail your ship off Somalia was very interesting to me. Of course, piracy has never disappeared, and it's been a problem in the Malacca Straits and off Indonesia for a long time. But in the Somali pirate era that I refer to now as about from 2005 to 2012 was sort of a blister on world history. And it was interesting for me to learn more about it.
Are there like similarities between the Barbary era and sort of Somalia circa 2008 that sort of are sort of indicative of why piracy might flourish?
Yes, absolutely. The main similarity is that they were both they were both territories, both Somalia and the North African shore, what we talk about as the Barbary Coast, were um, um, close to commercial corridors, which means that European trade as well as American trade, the young American trade in the late 1700s and early 1800s, had to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar. And those North African principalities up there that belonged to the Ottoman Empire were used to taking a tribute from the countries that wanted safe passage. And if not, if they hadn't paid up, then they got sacked by pirates. Somali piracy was not even close to that organized, but it still preyed on commercial vessels that had to go through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden.
I mean, Somalia had been a failed state since the early 1990s. Like, why was it that around 2008 that piracy began to flourish?
Well, something like it had been going on for ages. It had been going on for at least another 10 years before that. Somalia started to fall apart in 1991 when Siad Barre was toppled. And in the 90s, it became kind of a free-for-all for illegal fishing. And a lot of foreign vessels would come in pretty close to the Somali shore and actually steal fish because Somalia had no navy to protect its coastline. So in the 90s already, there were regional warlords or leaders who would send out bands of armed men on little skiffs and say to some of the foreign fishing ships, you need a license to fish here. But there was no federal government in Somalia to issue a license. So it was kind of a freelance operation where these bands of armed men would say, okay, well, a license costs about $50,000, and they would hold the ship for maybe 24 hours. And once the owners paid their dues, then it was done. And it was not exactly official, but it was how business got done. And the world only heard about it when that operation expanded and became a form of organized crime. And that the first time that happened was in 2005. A major, I think it was a tanker, got captured in 2005. And then it really picked up speed in about 2007.
So this is the context that brings you to Somalia in 2012. Can you sort of talk about like your specific sort of the day you were captured? What happened? What were you doing? Like, what was your kind of journalistic intent that day, say?
Sure. Well, Ashwin and I had actually spent about 10 days already gathering pretty good material. And Ashwin decided to fly to Mogadishu. So that day we took him to the airport and we saw him off. He flew away safely, but it was on the way back from the airport that a truck was actually waiting for us, kind of a battle wagon, a truck with a cannon bolted in the back. And
technical, probably.
A technical, yeah, exactly. That's what they're called in that part of the world. And they're fairly common because of the Somali Civil War. It was technicals that helped topple Siad Barre. And there it was waiting by the side of the road. It wasn't even clear it was for us at first, but when they noticed our car, they drove up towards us with the cannon aimed through our windshield and overpowered my guards. And there were about a dozen men in the flatbed who came over and pulled me out of the car.
And violently. I mean, you broke your you broke your wrist. Your glasses were smashed.
Yep, because they opened the door, and once I figured out what was going on, I mean, it was pretty clear actually. I tried to hold the door closed where they tried to open it, and they rammed my wrists with the muzzles of their Kalashnikovs and broke my wrist, pulled me out and bloodied my scalp. I mean, they beat me on the head, and I was wearing glasses which got swept off my face and sort of broken in the dust. And they took away my backpack, which was full of things too.
Those first few days, like what's going through your mind? Like, how are you coping? How are you sort of like interpreting what's happening to you?
I think I was in shock. I mean, I was really just stunned. Of course, I knew kidnapping was a risk. I was really just horrified that it had actually happened. So I was stunned by this new situation. All of a sudden I was bloodied and wearing nothing but torn clothes and having to camp in the bush with these men who meant me harm. So that shock didn't wear off for a few days, I don't think. If at all.
Yeah. But I mean, and initially they just started asking for like ridiculous sums of money, right?
Yeah, within a week, they handed me a phone and told me to call my family, and the first demand was $20 million.
And your mom at this point is like a retiree living in California, right?
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's interesting that you spoke to her several times over the length of your ordeal, and all the while she was sort of being advised by the FBI. But did you have any sense, I suppose, of like what her interactions were with the FBI? Obviously you probably know now, but did you have any sense of what was happening while
No, while I was there, I certainly didn't. I had no idea. I could tell sometimes that she'd been coached because she asked me for, like the name of my cat when I was young or something like that before we could start the conversation, which meant that somebody had told her to make sure that it was me on the phone. So I knew that sort of thing went on in the background in other hostage cases, and so I was aware it was happening to my mother. Frankly, I didn't know it was the FBI. I didn't know necessarily who was coaching her. It didn't have to be the FBI. Sometimes various branches of the U.S. government actually compete for to lead a case like that.
So pretty soon though, you're taken to a captured tuna vessel.
Mm-hmm.
How did your circumstances change when you went from sort of land to sea?
Right. Well, that was kind of a violent transition too. I was being held on land, mostly in Hobyo, when they captured that vessel. The same gang hijacked the Naham 3 out near the Seychelles and brought it into anchor by Hobyo when I was lying around with another hostage in a sort of Italian ruin, Italian colonial ruin in Hobyo. So we saw the ship when it got there, but it took a few weeks for them to decide to put us on board. And they probably did it to save money and consolidate us under one guard team, all the hostages. But I thought that my life was about to end. I mean, they placed us on board the ship. And they took my radio, they took my notes. I injured my back on the skiff getting out to the ship, and I just thought, this is going to be miserable, and they're going to take us away up the coast or something like that. And I really wanted to be off the ship at first. I really wanted to, or just commit suicide or something. It was the first time I felt like killing myself, I think. But as it turned out, the ship was a very good place to be compared to land because it had an active kitchen and the food wasn't bad. And there were 28 other hostages on board. So the crew of the Naham 3 we all got to be pretty good friends.
So, I mean, it's interesting because like throughout the book, it's, there's just like the mundane events of life take on sort of profound significance and having like good food, or as you said, this was like a tuna vessel and you occasionally ate some like fresh sashimi, were sort of moments of like pleasure, I suppose, that kind of shook you from the overwhelming despair that seems to be present throughout the pages of the book.
Well, definitely. We were anchored, as it happens, over a reef. And Rolly, who was my sort of my partner, he was the first hostage I was thrown together with on land, and sort of my partner on board.
And from the Seychelles, right?
He was a fisherman from the Seychelles. So we were constantly catching fresh fish from over the side from this coral reef, and Rolly is the one who said we're anchored over a reef, and he identified all these fish because he caught them himself in another life, So he would teach me the names in Seychellois Creole, and so it was an education for me. It was actually quite interesting, but these were moments during very long and tedious days. Life on board the ship was extremely boring too.
So I guess one really interesting thing, and it's treated, I think, very delicately and humanely is the experience of your captors. What do you know now of the gang that caught you, and kidnapped you? I mean, on the one hand, it's organized crime. On the other hand, like a lot of them kind of come across as bumbling idiots.
That's true.
And what's interesting, at least to me, is these are called in shorthand pirates, but their goal is not like the tuna or the oil on the fishing vessel that they've captured. It's the people on board.
Yeah.
To ransom them. Like you're the prize.
That's right. And that makes them different from other pirates. So, for example, there are pirates off the West African coastline right now, especially off Nigeria.
Yeah, the Gulf of Guinea. Yeah.
The Gulf of Guinea, where they do want the oil, they want the contraband, which is more typical, I think, for pirates in history. But the main goal of Somali pirates was really to get either a boat or some people who could be used as leverage for extortion, and we call that kidnapping for ransom.
But like just the idea that like some poor Chinese kid who made up like most of the crew on board would be sort of something that they could profitably trade for. It just kind of seems like a little far-fetched.
Well, it's incredible, but it did work. I mean, at least as long as the ship was intact, there was an owner who had a financial interest in getting it free. But there were no successful negotiations for the Naham 3 until very late, and by that time the ship had given out. But you're right; these are very poor men. The entire crew was from East Asia, and they had been recruited unethically, I think, in some cases by people who were promising them, a good daily wage, and basically put them in a situation where they had to fish long hours, and in some cases not get paid. So what I learned about the actual fishing industry was pretty stark too.
So can you tell me a bit about the gang that captured this gang? Like who led them? What was like the kind of political economy that sustained them?
Well, in my case, the lead operational guy was probably Ali Dulai, who was a fairly famous pirate. The top financier, I think, is an even more famous pirate named Mohammed Garfanji, and Garfanji seems to be in charge of all sorts of other kinds of businesses in central Somalia. Supposedly, he also invests in real estate in that part of the world, and he seems to have did have an armed band of soldiers around him that he sometimes hires out for security for small Somali towns. So I suspect he would like to legitimize himself and get into Somali politics, and I certainly hope that no one in Mogadishu lets him do that.
But to be a financier, so basically he's putting up the money to these underlings who then, and paying them to hold you captive in the event that he'd profit eventually from some ransom that was being paid.
Yeah, exactly. So the project of kidnapping somebody or taking a ship will be a business venture, and it costs an enormous amount of money up front. And so he'll stake up some of that money, but he'll also get investors. So he'll also have the connections to get loaned money from various places, and that can even come from abroad. You can get loans from, who knows, Somalis in Dubai or even America. But all those lenders plus the top financier like Garfanji will expect to have a big payout by the end. And those loans, by the way, that's how they keep it going. So if they somehow run out of budget after a couple of months and they haven't reached a deal, then they go out to lenders and they borrow more money.
Because so it seemed like the longer that you are held captive, the more expensive it is for them, which in turn means they probably either need to like demand more to cover their losses or cut their losses, right?
That's how it works. They have to pay attention to that, though, and they don't always seem to. I mean, they seem to think that the longer they hold someone, then the more money they can actually demand, and it simply doesn't work like that for human beings. It might work like that in the case of a ship, but once it became a kidnap for profit operation for people who are just being held on land, the calculus doesn't work the same.
So as you're being held, as you're held captive, you've studied piracy. You know sort of how these operations work.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is any of this, are these kind of calculations going through your head?
Well, I'm not sure I knew all the details. I'm still not sure I know all the details, but I was wondering where the money was coming from, and I was trying to figure out what the budgetary cycles were. Because at the beginning it seemed to work in 2-month cycles. I'm not sure about that, but at the beginning of a cycle, when there was more money, there was more food for the hostage, and my treatment was better. And when I could always tell when the money ran out because I didn't have so much food and water.
What did you learn about the kind of foot soldiers in this operation? The individuals who guarded you on a day-to-day basis.
They're pretty simple men. If they're guards, they try to convince you they're not actually pirates. But some of the guards eventually told me stories of being out on the water in a skiff. So sometimes they try and say, "Oh, we're not pirates. We're just guarding you and keeping you safe." But that was probably bullshit in many of the cases. There's simple men and they needed jobs. I mean, that much is true. But one point of the title of my book, The Desert and the Sea, is this conflict between the story they tell that all pirates are frustrated fishermen and the fact that most pirates I met were men from the bush. I mean, men from the countryside who simply knew how to work a rifle.
Mm-hmm. And again, we're kidnapping people, not sort of commandeering cargo.
Well, exactly. I mean, in my case, it had nothing to do with the illegal fishing.
So you survived, obviously, and in very difficult circumstances and situations. I guess one thing I have, and this may seem like kind of prosaic, but like, how did you sort of last and survive that long without glasses? This is something that kind of keeps, like, as someone who's horribly nearsighted, and you often refer to like just kind of making out blurry shapes, like, how did just like that experience, how did you make that? How did you make out? How did you sort of survive?
Well, it was horrible. I mean, it made me less able to figure out a situation quickly, and especially when they kept me in sort of a dim prison room, a dim concrete room. It was sometimes hard for me to distinguish between my guards because they would swap their clothes around, and one day, one pirate would be wearing the orange T-shirt, and the next day it would be somebody else. I wouldn't necessarily know who it was coming in the door at first. I think if I'd had better eyesight throughout the whole ordeal, I probably would have tried to escape more often.
That's interesting. To me, it's like, there's a lot very personal about your book, and there's a lot that's kind of like relatable. Just as me as a journalist, I mean, I don't go out to war zones, but I'm curious about the world, and I think about these things a lot. But just that like sort of loss of one's glasses to me, just like was kind of very personal, and you just kind of like wonder like how would you cope in this situation? And that's I think something that's comes through a lot in your book, and the elegant prose that you use, just like the reader puts themselves in your position often.
Right. Good. That's nice. Thank you.
So I want to learn about the circumstances of your I'm You don't disclose the amount of ransom that was paid, correct? I didn't get to the end of the book, by the way. I'm about halfway through, so I haven't read the rest. But
that's not a secret. It was $1.6 million.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a result of negotiation.
Where did that money come from, though? Like,
sorry,
where did that money come from?
My mother had to raise it with help from family and friends, and some of the magazines I'd worked for, and some institutions in the U.S. As well as Germany.
But did the government of the United States prevent your mother from trying to pay this ransom? Because isn't there like a long-standing? Yeah, no, they didn't.
No, absolutely not. And that's not the business of the government of the United States. And in fact, it's never been the policy of the government of the United States to prevent a family from raising ransom privately. Okay. There was some misunderstanding about that during James Foley's case. And somebody in the Obama government actually called up the Foley family and suggested that raising money for him to save him would have been tantamount to providing support for terrorism, material support, I think. It's true. Ransoms help criminals and terrorists, but it's never really been the policy of the U.S. to get in the way of private ransoms. And the person who said that to the Foley family wound up losing his job.
So, I mean, obviously this was like a very personal thing. Like, you were freed by this ransom money, yet this ransom money also sustained and was a reward to the people that tortured you and kidnapped you. And
some of them.
Well, I mean, how do you sort of come to terms with that contradiction? I mean, obviously we're here and talking, and I'm very thankful for that, and I'm sure you are, but how do you sort of process the fact that they're also sort of benefited from this?
Well, it's horrifying to think about, and it was horrifying to think about it while I was there. Not only am I losing a significant chunk of my life, but it's the very reason I'm doing that is to provide a whole lot of money for some very evil people. My only consolation is that the way it ended was probably better than most other hostage cases, in the sense that most of the time I was there, I was half afraid that there would be a military mission that might come in and kill all the guards I'd gotten to know, and maybe kill me, but maybe rescue me. And then there would be no ransom. That would be nice. But the men truly responsible, who were the bosses, would have been fine. And as it turned out, two days after I left Somalia, there was a shootout among the bosses over my ransom because they couldn't decide who should get what. And 5 relatively top guys died, in fact, including 2 bosses.
Again, on this question though of ransom, I mean, is there, like, how concerned are you that sort of paying these ransoms sustains the practice that resulted in your abduction and torture?
Well, that's exactly what it does in general. But as it turned out, this gang was pretty severely damaged by that shootout. And I think Mohammed Garfanji is still alive to enjoy some of that money. But Ali Dulai, for example, is not. I think that the experience of holding me, which lasted a long time and cost them a lot of money, as well as the damage to the upper ranks of that gang, represented a pretty significant dent in the gang's business model. So in the end, it hurt them. And I don't know if they're still out there trying to catch ships. I suspect some of the pirate bosses that I met probably are. But either the gang has weakened or moved into other businesses or something. I mean, the fact is that while I was in Somalia, piracy on the water as a practice sort of fell off. It became less trendy, and that has a lot to do with security measures the shipping industry took.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was like a NATO operation for a while, if I recall, and I know the UN backed some efforts as well in the Indian Ocean.
I think NATO's folded up its tents over there, but a couple other naval groups are still cruising off the coast. But the really helpful new tactic was for cargo ships to hire armed guards to ride along on otherwise peaceful merchant missions, right? And that helps protect them from pirates.
So, how did you come to learn? And can you tell the story of your release?
Oh, well, it happened suddenly on a day where I didn't really expect anything to happen. So when the pirates told me I was going to go free, at first I didn't believe them. And then they told me they were going to drive me to the airport, and then their story changed. They said, no, we're not going to drive you straight to the airport. We're going to hand you over to some other Somalis. And so I was convinced that I was not going free, that I was being sold to another gang, or, if not Al-Shabaab. So I was angry. I was frustrated. I was scared until I got to the next sort of layer of Somalis, and the driver of the car actually managed to use his phone to call my mother and a negotiator I had talked to. When I heard the two of them sounding very happy, I knew I was going free.
And so where did you were back at the same airport, right, in which you were initially kidnapped?
Yeah, eventually he drove me to another driver who took me to the hotel, to the to the Galkayo airport, and that's exactly where I saw Ashwinoff on that day that I got kidnapped. And waiting for me there was a Cessna that belonged to a bush pilot who I'm friends with in the meantime, a very good and very well trained pilot.
Yeah, it's funny. In the book, you describe him as the first competent person that you met in,
I'd met in a couple
days.
Of years. Yeah. Well, since I left the ship, because the men on the ship were competent, but everybody after that, all the pirates, I would say, not so much.
So, so you're flown eventually from Mogadishu to Djibouti to Nairobi, and you're met by U.S. and German officials. Like, what did you learn from these officials about sort of the official government efforts to locate you and to free you?
Oh, just that they did an enormous amount of work. I mean, I think both countries actually provide pretty good support for hostages and hostage families. The U.S. provides more than you'd think. The FBI was at my mother's door within a few hours of my capture, and she's quite happy with the information that they were able to give her. Not every hostage family is totally happy with that sort of thing, but it's not always the FBI, and sometimes the cases are different and very difficult. But my mom got along with the agents who came to see her, and the Germans that she wound up talking to also were quite good. I think there was a lot of military surveillance and a lot of people who were looking for me, which I'm grateful for.
Is there like a policy lesson that you could draw, based on your experience and your reflections on this experience, in terms of sort of what governments can do better to facilitate the release of people in your situation, of hostages in your situation?
I don't know that there's a policy lesson that's worth talking about in public, but the main lesson that I learned as an American is that the policy of not paying ransoms by the U.S. government and actually by most governments, is not actually a deterrent. In other words, a gang like the pirates who were holding me does not brush up on ransom policies by various governments and choose its victims accordingly. That just doesn't happen. And part of the reason is that either they don't pay attention or they don't believe the men in suits who, utter these things from behind podiums. The fact is that the guards holding me were brutally surprised when some other Somali told them that there was going to be no ransom from Washington. And one of them was actually angry at me 18 months into my captivity, which means that the word about America's ransom policy had not sort of moved around in pirate circles.
Why is there an element that can't be discussed publicly? Like, what do you mean by that?
Oh, I would just say there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes in a kidnapping case that you wouldn't even want the American government to announce that it's changing from one policy to another. So I would say it's just stuff like that you wouldn't even want announced.
So one of, again, in a story, in a book full with like really remarkable stories, to me, one of the most eye-opening is that one of your captors reached out to you on Facebook, not long after your release, right? Mm-hmm. I guess first, what was it like to sort of receive that message, and what have you learned, subsequently about this person and this person's life in the, months since?
He was a guard, and he was one of the gentler guards, as a matter of fact. And we've had a pretty good discussion online. He's helped with some of my research, so I sort of corroborated a few stories with his help, and so it hasn't been a bad relationship. And I learned that he had a background that was more or less like I expected from talking to the other guards. It was quasi-military. At some point, he wasn't making enough money, and so he joined the pirate gang. He was not a fisherman,
So, like, when you're on a book tour now, you've been on the Daily Show. I heard you on NPR, and you're sort of reliving these experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Is it like traumatic to relive those experiences, or is it cathartic, or something in between?
I would say it's more cathartic. The writing the book was, first of all, difficult, but also very cathartic. I mean, it was very helpful to put all these horrible experiences in order, in a narrative line. And it turns out that's what therapists do too. Therapy is good for that. But writing is not therapy, and talking is not necessarily therapy. It's just helpful to normalize it. In other words, to shove all this horrible experience into a corner is not healthy. So to admit to myself that it's part of my life and it's going to remain part of my life is actually quite good.
So what's next for you then? I mean, you're on book tour right now. What are your next? Do you have reporting projects in the pipeline that we could look forward to?
Yeah, I do. I'm following another trial here in the Midwest. I've got a couple of projects in the U.S. and I'm working on a new book. I'm also on the board of Hostage U.S., which is a very good nonprofit that gives support to families of people who have somebody kidnapped somewhere in the world. The governments do something as far as helping families ease their minds about what's going on. Hostage US can do a little bit more too. They fill in the gaps. None of it's operational. None of it has to do with actually bringing the person home. But as far as explaining to a family what to expect and what their loved one might be going through in captivity, that's what Hostage US is for, and I think it's a remarkable organization.
And I'll let you plug your forthcoming book as well. What's that?
The book I'm working on now?
Yeah.
It's a novel that I actually started in Somalia, because while I was taking notes, sometimes it was not advisable to write what was going on that day, and so I started to draft a piece of fiction, and it's turning into a novel.
And a piece of fiction about something far away, I would imagine.
Had nothing to do with it.
Keeping your mind as far away. Yeah. Oh,
exactly.
Well, good. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on the book, and I'm glad this has been like the experience of talking about the book has been cathartic, at least. So thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Michael Scott Moore. Wow. Yeah, no, that book, first of all, I know I said this before, it is really well written. It is gripping. It's a page turner. Highly recommend it. You should definitely go buy it. He's been on something of a book tour recently, gotten some high profile interviews, including on The Daily Show and on All Things Considered on NPR. So I hope and trust that the book is doing well, but definitely support authors you like. And yeah, I just keep coming back to this idea of being kidnapped off the coast of Somalia without my glasses and not being able to see. I mean, it makes a jarring and horrendous ordeal even sort of more, I think, disorienting and frankly frightening. So I can't even imagine. But like I said in the interview, he really does put you in his shoes when he was writing this book. All right, so we'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.